Daniel raised his champagne glass high enough for the light to catch it. And for a brief second, I believed this night was meant to honor everything we had built together. The ballroom shimmered under crystal chandeliers, the kind that scattered light like tiny stars across polished floors. Beyond the tall glass windows, the Atlantic rolled quietly against the Charleston shoreline, its steady rhythm calming in a way that always made me feel grounded. Investors, family members, and longtime partners filled the room, dressed in tailored suits and evening gowns, all gathered to celebrate the company that had carried our family name for generations. I stood beside Daniel at the front of the room, smiling politely as he began speaking into the microphone. His voice carried easily, confident and smooth, the same voice that had convinced investors to trust him and clients to believe in our vision. He spoke about growth, about expansion, about the future of the company, words I had heard him rehearse countless times before. Then he paused. Not a natural pause, not the kind used to emphasize a point. This one felt deliberate. His eyes shifted toward the ballroom entrance, and instinctively, mine followed. The double doors opened. Marissa stepped inside. My older sister walked into that room like she had never left, like the past decade of distance had never happened. She wore a crisp white suit that caught every eye in the room, her posture straight, her smile calm and calculated. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. And somewhere deep in my chest, something tightened in a way that made it hard to breathe. Daniel extended his hand toward her. Not casually, not politely, deliberately. He pulled her to his side, his fingers curling around hers as if the gesture had been practiced. "I think it's time this company had someone more suited to its future," he said into the microphone. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Marissa turned her gaze toward me, steady and cold, as if measuring how long it would take for the realization to reach my face. "You were never meant to lead this family," she said. And in that moment, surrounded by people who were supposed to be allies, I realized this wasn't a surprise to anyone but me. Earlier that evening, before the doors opened and the speeches began, I had stood in front of my bedroom mirror smoothing the front of a navy blue dress Daniel insisted I wear. "You'll look perfect in this," he had said, handing it to me that afternoon. I remember hesitating, running my fingers across the fabric. It wasn't my style. Too formal, too stiff. But he had been unusually insistent, standing there with that tight smile he wore when he wanted something done without argument. I ignored the unease settling quietly beneath my ribs. Now, standing in the ballroom with Marissa beside him, that memory replayed itself like a warning I had refused to hear. Before Marissa walked in, the room had felt warm, welcoming. People had been laughing, clinking glasses, congratulating Daniel and me on the company's anniversary milestone. Investors approached me earlier that night, thanking me for my years of involvement, for the countless meetings and long nights spent stabilizing contracts and guiding projects through difficult negotiations. I believed I belonged there, that this celebration was ours. But as applause broke out following Daniel's announcement, I noticed something strange. No one looked surprised. Guests smiled politely, nodding as if they had expected this moment all along. A few even leaned toward Marissa, greeting her warmly the way one welcomes an honored guest, not someone returning after years of absence. The realization settled slowly, painfully. They had known. Marissa stepped forward slightly, still holding Daniel's hand longer than necessary. "Thank you all for welcoming me back," she said, her voice smooth, controlled. "This business needs discipline, not sentiment." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Somewhere behind me, someone whispered, "Finally." That single word struck harder than any insult. Finally. As if my presence had been a mistake waiting to be corrected. I scanned the room instinctively, searching for familiar faces, people who once praised my work, who had trusted my judgment. But one by one, they avoided my eyes. Conversations resumed in low voices. Smiles remained fixed in place, polite and distant. And then I noticed something else. My father-in-law stood near the second table, glass raised, nodding in approval. Not toward me, toward Marissa. The betrayal didn't come with shouting or dramatic accusations. It came with silence, the kind that allows humiliation to settle slowly, completely, leaving no room for defense. Daniel turned toward me again, his smile tight, his voice lowering slightly as he leaned toward the microphone. "You've done your part," he said. "But the future requires someone stronger." The words felt rehearsed, prepared, delivered with surgical precision. I felt heat rising beneath my skin, a familiar surge of anger threatening to push past my carefully maintained composure. My fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, nails pressing into polished wood. For a moment, I wanted to speak, to challenge him, to remind everyone in that room of the years I spent stabilizing failing projects, negotiating impossible deals, preserving the company when others doubted it could survive. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled, not because I agreed, not because I forgave, because I refused to give them the spectacle they expected. As applause faded and conversations resumed, I noticed a server approaching me hesitantly. He leaned close, speaking in a careful whisper. "Ma'am, your place setting has been moved." I turned slowly toward the main table. My name card was gone, replaced by another. Marissa's. The message was clear. I was no longer welcome in my own seat. I stepped back slightly, forcing my breathing to remain steady as the room continued celebrating a future that no longer included me. And in the quiet space between one forced smile and the next, a memory surfaced, sharp and unexpected. 3 months earlier, my phone had rung late one afternoon while I was reviewing contracts in my office. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't expected. Samuel Hayes, our family's trust attorney. At the time, I had answered casually, assuming it was routine business. Now, standing alone in that ballroom as laughter echoed around me, that forgotten call returned with unsettling clarity. And for the first time that night, beneath the humiliation and confusion, something colder began to take shape inside my chest. Suspicion. The house was too quiet the next morning. The kind of silence that presses against your ears until even your own breathing sounds too loud. I woke before sunrise, though I couldn't remember sleeping. The space beside me in bed was cold, the sheets flat and undisturbed, as if Daniel had never come back to it after the party. I lay there for several seconds, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene from the ballroom, Marissa's steady smile, Daniel's practiced speech, the sound of applause that still echoed in my chest like something breaking. When I finally pushed myself upright, the first thing I noticed was the closet. Daniel's side wasn't empty, but it wasn't full either. Several suits were missing. The dark gray one he wore to investor meetings, the navy one he always saved for formal events. Even the leather travel bag he kept tucked beneath the hanging rack was gone. He hadn't packed in a hurry. He had prepared. That realization settled slowly into my chest, heavier than anything he had said the night before. I stepped into the hallway, my bare feet brushing against the polished hardwood floor. The house looked exactly the same framed photos along the walls, same soft morning light filtering through tall windows. Yet something inside it felt unfamiliar, like walking into a stranger's home wearing your own clothes. Downstairs, I found the kitchen spotless. Too spotless. Coffee had already been brewed, the scent lingering faintly in the air. But Daniel was nowhere in sight. A single mug sat near the sink, still damp, suggesting he had left recently. Miniature details began stacking themselves into something unmistakable. He had woken early, left without speaking, prepared long before I realized anything was wrong. I poured myself coffee, though I didn't want it, and leaned against the counter, staring out toward the backyard where the ocean wind pushed gently against palm leaves. The world outside looked calm, undisturbed. Inside me, something else was shifting. Not grief. Not yet. Suspicion. And with that suspicion came memory. 6 months earlier, that was the first time I saw Marissa again. The memory returned so vividly that for a moment, I could smell the faint salt air from the harbor outside the office windows. It had been an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was seated in the conference room overlooking Charleston Harbor, preparing notes for a board meeting. Sunlight spilled across the long wooden table, casting sharp lines across polished surfaces. Investors chatted quietly while waiting for Daniel to arrive. Then the door opened. Marissa walked in, not hesitantly, not cautiously, confidently, as if she belonged there. For a second, I thought I was imagining things. Marissa hadn't been involved in the business for years. She had distanced herself from the family after a series of arguments with our parents, choosing to live in another city and maintain only occasional contact. Yet there she was, dressed in a tailored blazer, carrying a slim folder beneath her arm. What unsettled me most wasn't her presence. It was Daniel's reaction. He didn't look surprised, not even slightly. Instead, he stood and greeted her with the kind of calm familiarity reserved for someone expected. "I hope no one minds," Marissa said, offering a polite smile to the room. "I'm just here to observe. Just here to observe." That was what she said. But instead of choosing an empty chair along the side wall, where guests typically sat, she moved toward the head of the table and placed her folder down as if claiming space already reserved. I remember feeling a flicker of discomfort in my chest. Small and easy to ignore. So I ignored it. At the time, I told myself it was family, that perhaps Daniel simply wanted to reconnect with her professionally. Families healed in strange ways, after all. But looking back now, I realized something else. Several of the investors greeted her warmly. Too warmly. Like they had already met her before that day. As if that introduction wasn't the beginning. Just the performance. A few days after that meeting, another strange thing happened. I had been reviewing emails late in the evening when a new message appeared in my inbox. The subject line caught my attention immediately. Updated Trust Participant Review. I remember pausing, frowning slightly as I opened the message. But before I could read past the first line, before my eyes even reached the body of the document, the email vanished. Gone. Not archived. Not redirected. Simply gone. I refreshed the screen once. Twice. 3 times. Nothing. The inbox remained blank, as if the message had never existed. At first, I assumed it was a technical error. Systems failed sometimes. Emails disappeared occasionally. That was what I told myself. But deep down, I knew something didn't feel right. Only a few individuals had the authority to remove internal communications at that level. Daniel, the chief accountant, and, as I later discovered, Marissa. She had been granted temporary administrative credentials shortly after that meeting. Another detail I dismissed. Another warning I ignored. Around that same time, family dinners began to change. Marissa started attending regularly, showing up with carefully measured warmth and polite conversation. Our parents welcomed her back with surprising ease, speaking of forgiveness and second chances as if past conflicts had never happened. One night, during dinner, my father said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. "People deserve another opportunity to prove themselves," he said calmly. He smiled toward Marissa as he spoke, not toward me. Daniel listened to her suggestions during those dinners with unusual focus. Whenever I offered ideas, adjustments to property planning, revisions to development timelines, he interrupted me gently, redirecting attention back toward Marissa. At the time, I told myself it was temporary, that things would balance again, that loyalty still mattered. Then came the phone call, late one afternoon, while reviewing project contracts in my office. My phone rang unexpectedly. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't seen in years. Samuel Hayes, our family trust attorney. His voice sounded formal, careful, measured. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "are you personally reviewing your inheritance documentation?" The question caught me off guard. I remember laughing lightly, brushing it aside. "Daniel handles most of that," I replied. There was a pause. Not long, but noticeable. The kind of silence that carries meaning. "There are provisions," Samuel said slowly. that require your direct awareness. Before I could respond, Daniel walked into my office. Samuel's tone shifted instantly. "We can discuss routine updates another time," he added, then ended the call abruptly. I remember glancing up at Daniel as he stood in the doorway, watching me carefully. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now, standing in the quiet kitchen months later, replaying every detail, the memory felt different. Heavy, intentional, not random at all. I carried my coffee toward the dining table and sat down slowly, staring at nothing in particular as fragments of the past assembled themselves into something clearer. Then another memory surfaced, one I had tried to forget. Late one evening, weeks after Marissa's return, I stayed behind at the office longer than usual. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving the building unusually silent. I opened the shared legal archive folder, one rarely used unless documents required formal review. Scrolling through the list of files, one title caught my attention: Carter Family Trust, Beneficiary Revision. I clicked it, and when the document opened, my breath stopped. Marissa's name appeared on the beneficiary list. Clear, official, permanent. But my signature, the signature required for that revision, was nowhere to be found. And that was the moment I should have understood what was happening. Instead, I told myself there must be an explanation. That family wouldn't betray family. Now, sitting alone in that quiet kitchen, the truth settled around me like fog. The humiliation from the ballroom wasn't the beginning. It was the ending of something that had already been unfolding for months. I sat at the kitchen table with the sealed envelope resting in front of me, staring at it long enough that the sunlight creeping across the marble countertop began to warm the edge of the paper. The house was still too quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Not comforting quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel watched even when no one is standing nearby. My fingers hovered over the seal for several seconds before I finally broke it open. The sound of tearing paper echoed louder than it should have in the empty kitchen. Inside were several pages, thick and official-looking, stamped with seals that immediately made my chest tighten. At the top of the first page, bold lettering caught my attention. Carter Family Trust, Amendment Disclosure Notice. I swallowed slowly, my mouth suddenly dry. For years, Daniel handled everything connected to the trust. He told me it was complicated, full of legal language I didn't need to burden myself with. I trusted him. I believed him when he said it was safer that way. Now, staring down at those pages, I realized how dangerous that trust had been. Not the trust itself, the trust I placed in him. I turned the page slowly, scanning words that once felt distant from my life. Beneficiary, trustee, authority transfer, successor rights. The language felt heavy, deliberate, written by someone who expected conflict long before it ever happened. A memory surfaced as I read. My grandfather sitting at the head of the old dining table years ago, his voice steady, his expression calm. Protection isn't about reacting, he once told me. It's about preparing before anyone else sees the danger. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Now I wondered if he had been talking about family. Halfway down the third page, something caught my attention. A section highlighted in yellow. Not by accident. Deliberately. My eyes moved across the sentence slowly, reading each word twice. In the event of internal family conflict affecting operational authority, controlling rights may be transferred under defined protective conditions. I read it again, and again. My heart began beating faster, not from fear, but from the realization that this document wasn't just a warning. It was a shield. If used correctly. I reached for my phone without thinking and dialed the number printed on Samuel Hayes's card. Each ring stretched longer than the last. For a moment, I wondered if he wouldn't answer at all. Then his voice came through the line, calm but alert. "Mrs. Carter, I received the documents," I said quietly. There was a brief pause. Not hesitation. Calculation. "Then we need to speak in person," he replied. "Not over the phone." His tone sharpened the air around me. Something about the way he said those words made the kitchen suddenly feel smaller. Unsafe. Why not over the phone? I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Because what you're holding, he said carefully, is not information that should be discussed where others might listen. My grip tightened around the phone. Others might listen. I glanced toward the staircase instinctively, even though I had not heard movement. Samuel continued speaking, his voice measured and precise. There have been changes made to the trust, he said. Changes that were not authorized by you. The words hit harder than I expected. Who made them? I asked. Silence filled the line. That silence answered before he ever spoke. Finally, he exhaled quietly. There is more than one name involved. A chill moved slowly down my spine. Not just Daniel. Someone else. Someone I already suspected. Marissa. My thoughts moved faster now, connecting pieces that once felt scattered. The meetings. The emails. The disappearance of documents. Then Samuel spoke again. And this time, he said a name I did not expect. Victor Lane. I froze. Victor Lane. The former operations manager Daniel forced out years ago. The man Daniel called disloyal. The man I believed had betrayed the company. For years. His name had been spoken with quiet resentment, always tied to accusations of misconduct and poor judgment. But now Samuel was saying his name in connection with trust documents. Not accusations. Evidence. Victor's signature appears in related documentation, Samuel said calmly. My breath caught. Not because I trusted Victor, but because I didn't understand how he fit into this. Memory shifted suddenly, replaying an old conversation I had nearly forgotten. Years ago, standing in the hallway outside the office, Victor had spoken quietly while reviewing paperwork. Not everyone in this family plays fair, he said. At the time, I dismissed him. I assumed bitterness had clouded his judgment. Now, that warning felt different, sharper, more dangerous. We need to meet, Samuel continued. In person. Tonight. Where? I asked. He gave me the location of a private legal archive building downtown. Not his office. Not anywhere familiar. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere secure. You must come alone, he added. His words carried weight that settled deep into my chest. Tell no one. I lowered the phone slowly after the call ended, my reflection faintly visible in the polished surface of the kitchen window. Fear was still there, but something else had begun replacing it. Understanding. Everything that once felt random now lined up with frightening clarity. Marissa's return. Daniel's secrecy. The disappearing email. The altered permissions. The forged authority. None of it had been accidental. It had been designed. I gathered the documents carefully and placed them inside my bag, moving slowly but deliberately. My movements felt different now, less reactive, more intentional. As I stepped toward the front door, something outside caught my attention. Through the glass, I saw it immediately. Daniel's car, parked in the driveway. Not gone after all. He had returned quietly, without telling me, without announcing himself. My pulse quickened, but I forced my breathing to remain steady. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, measured, controlled, heading somewhere. Daniel's voice came from just a few feet away. Too calm, too casual. I turned slowly to face him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes dropped briefly toward the bag in my hand. He noticed, of course he noticed, every movement, every detail. Then he looked back at me, offering a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. Did Samuel contact you? The question landed like a stone in my chest. I hadn't told him. No one had. Which meant only one thing. He already knew. And in that moment, something inside me shifted completely. This was no longer about a marriage falling apart. This was about control, power, and the quiet war unfolding inside my own home. The moving truck was already parked in front of the house when I turned into the driveway, its engine humming low like something alive and impatient. For a moment, I sat behind the steering wheel without moving, staring at the unfamiliar vehicle blocking part of the front walk. Two men in work uniforms carried a long piece of furniture toward the open front door, stepping carefully across the polished stone path I had personally chosen years ago. No one had told me anything about movers. Not Daniel. Not anyone. A slow unease crept into my chest as I stepped out of the car, the humid coastal air clinging to my skin. The house stood exactly as it always had. White columns, wide windows, perfectly trimmed hedges. Yet something about it felt different, like a photograph that had been subtly altered without anyone noticing. I walked toward the entrance, hearing voices before I even reached the door. Marissa's voice. Clear. Confident. Commanding. Careful with that piece, she instructed sharply. It goes into the study, not the sitting room. I stepped inside slowly, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The living room had been turned into controlled chaos. Boxes lined the walls. Cushions were stacked on chairs. Two movers carried away the long mahogany console table I had selected myself nearly a decade earlier. Marissa stood near the center of the room, holding a clipboard as if she had lived there all her life. She looked up when she saw me, her expression calm, almost pleasant. Oh, good. You're home, she said casually. I thought you'd want to approve the layout. But she didn't pause. She didn't wait. She didn't actually ask for approval. The words were nothing more than decoration. Behind her, Daniel stepped into view, his hands tucked comfortably into his pockets, observing the activity as if this were the most natural thing in the world. What's happening? I asked, my voice steady despite the tightness building in my chest. Marissa turned slightly, glancing around the room with quiet satisfaction. We're making improvements, she replied. Modernizing the space. Modernizing. That was the word she chose. As if my choices, my years spent building this home, were outdated. One of the movers passed beside me carrying a framed painting from the wall. I recognized it instantly. I had purchased it during a business trip years earlier, after closing one of the most difficult deals of my career. Now it was being removed without discussion, without permission, without acknowledgement. I moved upstairs before either of them could say anything else. Each step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the hallway, my chest tightened at the sight of my office door standing wide open. I never left it open. Inside, the room looked wrong, empty in places where it once felt full. My desk had been cleared completely. Papers that once sat neatly organized in labeled trays were gone. My computer remained, but the cables had been disconnected, hanging loosely behind the desk like abandoned threads. Several cardboard boxes sat stacked against the wall. I walked slowly toward them. Inside the first box were framed certificates, years of work, years of effort, placed carelessly on top of one another. One of them lay face down. I lifted it carefully. My professional certification, the one I earned after months of late nights and endless revisions. Someone had turned it over as if it meant nothing. You won't need that office anymore. Marissa's voice came from the doorway behind me. I turned slowly. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching me with quiet confidence. Who decided that? I asked. She didn't hesitate. The leadership team. Leadership team. Not family. Not partnership. A group that apparently no longer included me. Something sharp pressed against my chest, not panic. Not sadness, something colder. Understanding. Later that evening, after the movers left and the house fell into a strange, unfamiliar silence, I sat at the kitchen counter with my laptop open in front of me. Routine had always grounded me. Numbers made sense. Accounts followed patterns. Control lived inside details. I typed in my banking credentials, fingers moving automatically across the keyboard. Password entered. Submit. The screen froze for half a second. Then the message appeared. Access denied. I frowned and tried again. Slower this time. Same result. Access denied. A thin thread of tension tightened across my shoulders. I reached for my phone and dialed the bank. After verifying my identity, The representative spoke in a tone that felt far too neutral. "Your account permissions were updated earlier today," she explained. "Updated how?" I asked. "Administrative access changes were authorized." "By who?" There was a pause as she reviewed records. "Daniel Brooks," she answered. My grip tightened around the phone. Financial control. Shifted without my consent. Without warning. Without discussion. Later that night, dinner unfolded in the same suffocating calm that had begun to define the house. Daniel sat at the head of the table. Marissa to his right. Daniel's parents across from them. I took my usual seat, though it felt less secure than before. Conversation moved around me like water around stone. Marissa spoke confidently about restructuring development projects. Daniel nodded in agreement, responding to her suggestions as if they were already approved decisions. Not once did either of them ask for my input. Not once did anyone acknowledge the years I spent building those same systems they now discussed so casually. At one point, Daniel's father raised his glass. "To progress," he said. The toast hung in the air. No one looked at me. No one included me. After dinner, I moved quietly toward Daniel's office. A strange pull guided my steps, part curiosity, part survival instinct. Inside, the room smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. The wall safe sat exactly where it always had. For years, I knew the code by memory. I approached it slowly and entered the numbers. The keypad beeped once, then again, then reset. The code had been changed. Without telling me, without explanation. My reflection stared back at me from the polished surface of the safe door. Locked out. Physically, symbolically, I turned away slowly and moved toward the downstairs filing cabinet instead. Most drawers contained routine records, tax documents, insurance files, maintenance logs. Nothing unusual. Until I reached the final drawer. Inside lay a folder labeled Executive Authority Revision. My fingers hesitated before opening it. Something deep inside warned me that whatever I found there would change everything. I flipped through the pages carefully, then froze. My signature appeared on the final page. Clear, bold, official, but wrong. The strokes were too sharp, too narrow. Not mine. I knew my signature the way a person knows their own reflection. And this wasn't it. Someone had copied my name. Forged it. Authorized decisions I never approved. My breathing grew uneven as realization settled over me like cold water. This was no longer about betrayal. This was fraud. And just as I closed the folder, trying to steady my hands, something else caught my attention on the desk. Another document. Unopened. Stamped in red ink. Pending final authorization. I opened it slowly, dread building with every passing second. Inside was a draft agreement. Property listings. Ownership transfers. Signatures prepared. Mine included. Forged again. They weren't just pushing me aside. They were preparing to sell everything, my family's legacy. My grandfather's work, without me ever knowing it happened. And in that moment, sitting alone in that silent office, the truth settled in with brutal clarity. They weren't trying to replace me. They were trying to erase me. I sat in my car outside the small coffee shop downtown, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary as condensation formed along the inside of the windshield. The sky hung low and gray over Charleston that morning, the kind of heavy coastal weather that made everything feel slower, thicker, harder to move through. People passed by on the sidewalk with steaming cups in their hands, unaware that inside my chest, something had shifted beyond repair. Samuel had told me to meet someone here, a name I hadn't heard spoken in years. Victor Lane. Even thinking it made my jaw tighten. Victor had once been a central figure in our company, sharp, efficient, respected by employees who valued structure over charm. Then one day, almost overnight, he was gone. Daniel said Victor violated company trust, mishandled financial protocols, jeopardized partnerships. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? Back then, I believed everything Daniel told me. Now, sitting alone in that parked car, watching the glass doors of the coffee shop open and close. A new thought pressed its way forward. What if Victor didn't betray us? What if he tried to warn us? Or worse, what if he tried to warn me? The passenger door opened suddenly, pulling me from my thoughts. Victor slid into the seat beside me without hesitation. He looked older than I remembered, streaks of gray cutting through dark hair, faint lines tracing the corners of his eyes, but his posture remained steady, controlled. He carried the same worn leather briefcase I remembered from years earlier. The edges softened by time. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. His voice was calm, measured, not defensive, not apologetic, careful. "I wasn't sure I should," I replied. He gave a faint nod, as if expecting that answer. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Silence stretched between us. Thick with history neither of us had fully understood. Then Victor reached down and placed a sealed folder onto the center console between us. He didn't open it. He didn't push it toward me. He simply let it sit there, waiting. "You trusted him," Victor said quietly. "Not as an accusation, as a statement of fact." I swallowed slowly. "Daniel said you betrayed the company." Victor let out a quiet breath, leaning back against the seat. "That's what he wanted you to believe." His eyes shifted toward the folder. "I discovered irregular transfers," he continued. "Large ones, quiet ones, moving through accounts that didn't require immediate review." A faint chill spread along my arms. "What kind of transfers?" I asked. Victor tapped the folder once, the kind that slowly shift control without anyone noticing. I stared at the folder for several seconds before finally opening it. Inside were neatly arranged copies of financial records, transaction logs, account summaries, authorization sheets. Every page was labeled organized, undeniable. I flipped through the first few sheets carefully. Amounts moved between accounts. Property ownership restructured. Internal approvals marked under Daniel's name. And beneath those approvals, Marissa's. My breath caught in my throat. "She was involved this whole time," I whispered. Victor nodded once. "Long before she showed up at that party." My fingers trembled slightly as I turned another page. Then I saw it. A familiar shape. My signature. Except it wasn't mine. The same sharp edges. The same unnatural slant. Forgery. Planned months before I ever noticed. A cold wave of realization rolled through my chest. "They were preparing to remove me," I said quietly. Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a small black device. He held it carefully between his fingers. "A recording," he said. My pulse quickened. "Of what?" He pressed a small button. Static crackled softly before voices emerged. Daniel's voice. Clear. Confident. Unmistakable. "Once she's out of the trust, everything transfers cleanly," Daniel said. My stomach tightened painfully. Then Marissa's voice followed. "Cool. Calculated. Once she's removed from authority, the company belongs to us." The words echoed inside the car like thunder trapped in a small space. Another voice entered, unfamiliar. A consultant. By the sound of it. "You'll need her signature," the man said cautiously. A pause followed. Then Marissa spoke again. "That won't be a problem." I stopped breathing. Every muscle in my body locked into place as understanding settled into my bones. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was a long, careful plan, one that began long before that ballroom humiliation. Victor turned off the recording slowly. Silence rushed back into the car. Thick, heavy, unavoidable. "They thought you wouldn't question anything," he said quietly. I stared down at the documents resting in my lap. Every page felt heavier than the last. "What happens now?" I asked. Victor leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening. "They scheduled the sale," he said. My heart skipped once. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." The words hit like a physical blow. "They're planning to transfer major property holdings to outside investors," he continued. "Once that happens, Reversing it becomes nearly impossible. I closed the folder slowly, pressing it flat against my chest as if holding it closer could somehow stabilize the storm building inside me. Fear flickered, but it didn't stay. Something else replaced it. Focus. Sharp. Controlled. "I need to see Samuel," I said. Victor nodded once. Immediately. He paused, studying my face carefully. "If they complete that sale," he added quietly, "you won't just lose the company." His words slowed. Deliberate. Measured. "You'll lose your inheritance, your authority, and every legal right your grandfather left behind." The weight of that truth settled deep inside my chest. Not panic. Not despair. Clarity. For the first time since the night at the ballroom, my hands stopped trembling. I tightened my grip on the folder and looked straight ahead through the windshield. This was no longer about humiliation. No longer about betrayal. This was about survival. And that was the moment I understood something with terrifying certainty. I wasn't fighting to save my marriage anymore. I was fighting to save my future before it was sold out from under me. The Legal Archive building stood at the corner of a narrow downtown street, its brick walls darkened by decades of coastal storms and humid air. I parked across the street and sat for a moment, staring at the heavy wooden doors, feeling the weight of everything pressing against my chest. The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and the quiet felt deliberate, like this place was designed to keep secrets safe. Inside my bag, the folder Victor gave me rested against my side like something alive, something dangerous, something powerful. I stepped out of the car and crossed the street slowly, the sound of my heels echoing against the pavement louder than usual. When I reached the door, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air inside smelled like paper and dust, old records, old promises, old mistakes. Samuel Hayes stood alone at the far end of the room, waiting beside a long wooden table stacked with thick legal volumes. He looked exactly as he always had, calm, steady, controlled. But there was tension in the way he held his shoulders. "You came quickly," he said. "I didn't have a choice," I replied. I placed Victor's folder onto the table between us. Samuel opened it immediately, scanning each page with focused attention. His expression barely changed as he flipped through financial records, forged signatures, and transaction histories. But I watched closely. I saw the moment his eyes sharpened, saw the moment understanding settled in. "This confirms it," he said quietly. "Confirms it." Two simple words that felt heavier than anything else spoken that night. "What does it mean?" I asked. Samuel closed the folder carefully and rested his palms against the table. "It means the amendments they filed against you are vulnerable," he said. "Forgery connected to trust. Authority invalidates their claims." A slow breath left my lungs. Not relief. Not yet. Just awareness. Samuel turned toward a nearby shelf and retrieved a thick-bound document, older than anything else in the room. He carried it carefully, as if it held something fragile inside. "This trust," he said, placing the volume on the table, "was designed by your grandfather to withstand betrayal." The word betrayal lingered between us. Samuel flipped through the pages until he reached a marked section, a faded ribbon tucked carefully between yellowed sheets of paper. "Your grandfather believed the greatest threat wouldn't come from outside," Samuel continued. "He believed it would come from inside the family." My chest tightened slightly. That sounded exactly like him. Always thinking ahead. Always preparing. Samuel turned the book so I could read the page. I leaned forward slowly, my eyes scanning the handwritten clause. "In the event of intentional displacement through deceit, coercion, or fraudulent authority, controlling rights shall transfer to the injured beneficiary." I read the sentence once, then again, and again. Each time, the meaning grew clearer. "They tried to remove me," I whispered. Samuel nodded once. "And in doing so," he said, "they triggered the very protection meant to stop them." Something shifted inside me. Not hope. Something stronger. Possibility. Samuel lifted another document from the table. "There are conditions," he added. This protection only activates under specific circumstances. My pulse quickened. What kind of circumstances? He held up 3 fingers. First, proof of fraud. You have that. He lowered 1 finger. Second, proof of intent. The recording Victor preserved satisfies that requirement. Another finger lowered. Third, submission before any major restructuring becomes legally binding. My throat tightened. When is the sale scheduled? Samuel glanced at the calendar beside him. Tomorrow morning? The words hit harder than expected. Tomorrow. Not weeks away. Not distant. Immediate. If they complete that transaction, Samuel continued, ownership structure changes permanently, meaning settled in slowly. If that happens, I said quietly, the trust can't protect me. Samuel nodded once. Not effectively. Silence filled the room. Heavy. Unavoidable. I remembered standing in my grandfather's study years ago, watching him review ledgers late into the night. He once told me that protection wasn't about reacting to danger. It was about anticipating it before anyone else saw it coming. Now I understood what he meant. Samuel pulled several blank documents from a drawer and placed them on the table. We must file an emergency injunction, he said. The phrase sounded formal. Sharp. Final. What does that do? I asked. It freezes major transactions until legal review is completed, he explained. It stops the sale. My pulse quickened. Stops the sale. Stops Daniel. Stops Marissa. Samuel reached for his pen and began drafting quickly, his handwriting precise and steady. The scratching sound of ink against paper filled the silent room. Each movement felt deliberate, controlled, necessary. My phone vibrated suddenly inside my bag. The sound made me flinch. I pulled it out slowly. Marissa. Her name glowed across the screen. I ignored the call. Seconds later, another vibration. Then another. Finally, a message appeared. Where are you? The words were short, cold, suspicious. I looked up at Samuel. They know something, I whispered. He didn't look surprised. You must assume they are watching closely, he replied. A chill ran down my spine. Not paranoia. Preparation. Samuel slid the first completed document toward me. Read carefully, he instructed. I scanned the pages slowly, absorbing every word. Legal language once felt overwhelming. Now it felt empowering. Every sentence represented control being reclaimed, protection being activated. When I reached the final page, Samuel handed me a pen. Sign here. I hesitated for half a second. Not from doubt, from awareness. For months, someone else had forged my signature to strip away my authority. Now, I was reclaiming it. I pressed the pen against paper and wrote my name slowly, carefully, deliberately. My real signature, strong, steady. Samuel placed an official stamp onto the document, pressing firmly until the sound echoed through the room. A final sound, a decisive sound, like a door closing. He gathered the completed documents into a neat stack, preparing them for submission. Then he paused, studying me carefully. There is something else you should know, he said. I met his gaze. What? He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. Victor wasn't acting alone when he preserved those records. Confusion flickered through my mind. What do you mean? Samuel exhaled slowly. Years ago, before his passing, your grandfather instructed Victor to remain alert. My breath caught. He suspected conflict would come. Samuel continued. He believed someone within the family might eventually attempt to take control. The weight of those words settled deep inside my chest. My grandfather had seen this coming. Long before Daniel. Long before Marissa. Long before me. He protected me, even after he was gone. My phone vibrated again. Another message appeared. This time from Daniel. Board meeting moved earlier. The words blurred for a moment as urgency flooded my chest. Earlier, less time. Less margin for error. Samuel gathered the documents into his briefcase and snapped it shut. We leave now. he said firmly. I nodded once, my pulse steady despite the storm building ahead. Because in that moment, something became perfectly clear. They believed they had already won. But tomorrow morning, I would walk into that room holding the power they never saw coming. The sun had barely risen when I stepped out of the car in front of the company headquarters. The glass exterior reflecting pale morning light that made everything look colder than usual. For years, I walked into that building with quiet confidence, believing it was a place I helped shape, protect, and grow. That morning felt different. Not unfamiliar, just heavier. Like every step forward carried the weight of everything that had been hidden from me. Security glanced up as I entered the lobby. Their expressions changed the moment they recognized me. Respect returned. Not warmth, not sympathy, respect. And that alone told me something had already begun shifting. I noticed unfamiliar faces near the reception desk, sharply dressed men and women holding leather portfolios, speaking quietly among themselves. Investors, legal representatives, people brought in to finalize the sale Daniel had been planning, meaning it had already started. I tightened my grip on the folder in my hand and walked toward the elevators without hesitation. The ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual. Every second stretched thin, like the space between thunder and lightning. When the doors finally opened, the hallway stood empty, quiet except for distant voices filtering from the boardroom. They were already gathered, already moving forward, already believing I had been removed. I walked down the hallway slowly, my heels striking the polished floor with controlled rhythm. Each step echoed louder than expected, announcing my arrival before I even reached the door. Then I pushed it open. Conversation stopped immediately. Every face in the room turned toward me. Daniel sat at the head of the table, posture rigid, expression tightening the moment he saw me. Marissa sat beside him, her back straight, lips pressed into a confident smile that flickered just slightly at the edges. Investors filled the remaining seats. Stacks of documents spread neatly across the table. No one spoke at first. Silence took control of the room. I didn't expect you to attend today, Daniel said finally. His voice sounded calm. Too calm. Like he was performing control rather than feeling it. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked forward and took my usual seat, noticing something that made my pulse steady. My nameplate still sat in front of the chair, untouched. Legally. I still existed inside that room. For now, Daniel resumed speaking, forcing his attention back to the investors. As I was saying, he continued, clicking through presentation slides projected onto the large screen behind him. This restructuring positions us for long-term growth. Numbers flashed across the display. Property values. Projected returns. Ownership transitions. I watched quietly as years of work, decades of family effort, were reduced to percentages and profit margins. Daniel spoke confidently, guiding the conversation as if my absence had already been secured. Marissa nodded along, occasionally adding small remarks, reinforcing his narrative with unsettling ease. Then I noticed the stack of documents near the center of the table. Signature pages prepared. Ready? Waiting. They planned to finalize everything that morning. Before I could react, before I could intervene, Daniel reached for the final folder. This concludes our overview, he said smoothly. We'll proceed with authorization signatures. That was the moment. I stood, slowly, calmly. This meeting cannot proceed. My voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The room froze. Daniel's hand paused mid-motion above the papers. Investors exchanged confused glances. Before Daniel could respond, the door behind me opened. Samuel Hayes stepped inside. His presence shifted the atmosphere instantly. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just undeniable authority entering a space built on control. He walked forward without hesitation and placed a sealed set of documents on the center of the table. Emergency injunction has been issued, he announced. His voice remained steady, professional, final. What does that mean? One of the investors asked. Samuel answered without looking at Daniel. It means all pending transactions involving trust-controlled assets are frozen, pending investigation. The words landed like stones. Daniel stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You can't interfere with legitimate business." Samuel continued speaking over him. "Forgery connected to trust authority has been identified," he said calmly. "Further investigation is underway." Murmurs spread across the table. Marissa leaned forward, her composure cracking slightly. "That's an accusation," she said sharply. "It's evidence," Samuel replied. The door opened again. Victor Lane entered. Gasps rippled across the room. Even Daniel looked momentarily stunned. Victor placed another folder on the table and opened it slowly, revealing transaction logs, signature comparisons, and authorization documents. He pressed a small device. Static filled the air for a second. Then voices emerged. Daniel's voice. Clear, confident, unmistakable. Once she's out of the trust, everything transfers cleanly. The room went silent. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. Marissa's face drained of color. The recording continued briefly, just long enough to remove all doubt. Victor turned it off. Samuel spoke again. "Based on the provisions established within the Carter Family Trust," he said, "controlling authority transfers immediately to the injured beneficiary." He turned toward me. "Effective now." Every eye in the room shifted in my direction. Shock, confusion, fear. Daniel's hands tightened into fists at his sides. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice rising. "This is a misunderstanding." Samuel placed another document in front of him. "Forensic handwriting confirmation," he said calmly. "Forgery verified." Daniel's confidence cracked. Not loudly, quietly, visibly. Investors began collecting their papers, murmuring among themselves. Some stepped away from the table entirely, distancing themselves from the situation unfolding before them. Marissa leaned toward Daniel, whispering urgently, her voice sharp and desperate. But nothing she said changed what had already happened. I stepped forward slowly. Every movement felt deliberate, controlled, final. Then I moved toward the head of the table, toward Daniel's chair. For a moment, he didn't move. He simply stared at me, disbelief settling into his expression like something breaking. Then he stepped aside. I placed my hands on the back of the chair and lowered myself into it. The same seat he occupied minutes earlier. Authority shifting physically, symbolically, irreversibly. "This company is not for sale," I said. Not loudly, not angrily, just clearly. Silence followed. Deep. Complete. One by one, investors began leaving the room, their confidence replaced by caution. Daniel and Marissa remained seated, frozen in place as the structure they built around deception collapsed piece by piece. I gathered the documents slowly, organizing them into neat stacks. Victory didn't feel loud. It felt steady, controlled. Samuel leaned slightly toward me as the room emptied. "This isn't over yet," he said quietly. I turned toward him. "What do you mean?" "There is still one unresolved provision inside the trust," he replied. My chest tightened slightly. Another layer. Another secret. Something even Daniel hadn't anticipated. As the last investor stepped out of the room and the door closed behind them, a strange calm settled over the space. The battle had been won, but something deeper still waited beneath the surface. And in that moment, sitting at the head of the table for the first time in my life, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. This victory wasn't the end. It was the beginning of discovering the final truth my grandfather left behind. The sun had barely risen when I stepped out of the car in front of the company headquarters, the glass exterior reflecting pale morning light that made everything look colder than usual. For years, I walked into that building with quiet confidence, believing it was a place I helped shape, protect, and grow. That morning felt different. Not unfamiliar, just heavier. Like every step forward carried the weight of everything that had been hidden from me. Security glanced up as I entered the lobby. Their expressions changed the moment they recognized me. Respect returned. Not warmth, not sympathy. Respect. And that alone told me something had already begun shifting. I noticed unfamiliar faces near the reception desk, sharply dressed men and women holding leather portfolios, speaking quietly among themselves. Investors, legal representatives, people brought in to finalize the sale Daniel had been planning, meaning it had already started. I tightened my grip on the folder in my hand and walked toward the elevators without hesitation. The ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual. Every second stretched thin, like the space between thunder and lightning. When the doors finally opened, the hallway stood empty, quiet except for distant voices filtering from the boardroom. They were already gathered, already moving forward, already believing I had been removed. I walked down the hallway slowly, my heels striking the polished floor with controlled rhythm. Each step echoed louder than expected, announcing my arrival before I even reached the door. Then I pushed it open. Conversation stopped immediately. Every face in the room turned toward me. Daniel sat at the head of the table, posture rigid, expression tightening the moment he saw me. Marissa sat beside him, her back straight, lips pressed into a confident smile that flickered just slightly at the edges. Investors filled the remaining seats. Stacks of documents spread neatly across the table. No one spoke at first. Silence took control of the room. "I didn't expect you to attend today," Daniel said finally. His voice sounded calm. Too calm. Like he was performing control rather than feeling it. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked forward and took my usual seat, noticing something that made my pulse steady. My nameplate still sat in front of the chair, untouched. Legally, I still existed inside that room. For now, Daniel resumed speaking, forcing his attention back to the investors. "As I was saying," he continued, clicking through presentation slides projected onto the large screen behind him. "This restructuring positions us for long-term growth." Numbers flashed across the display. Property values, projected returns, ownership transitions. I watched quietly as years of work, decades of family effort, were reduced to percentages and profit margins. Daniel spoke confidently, guiding the conversation as if my absence had already been secured. Marissa nodded along, occasionally adding small remarks, reinforcing his narrative with unsettling ease. Then I noticed the stack of documents near the center of the table. Signature pages prepared. Ready? Waiting. They planned to finalize everything that morning. Before I could react, before I could intervene, Daniel reached for the final folder. "This concludes our overview," he said smoothly. "We'll proceed with authorization signatures." That was the moment. I stood, slowly, calmly. "This meeting cannot proceed." My voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The room froze. Daniel's hand paused mid-motion above the papers. Investors exchanged confused glances. Before Daniel could respond, the door behind me opened. Samuel Hayes stepped inside. His presence shifted the atmosphere instantly. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just undeniable authority entering a space built on control. He walked forward without hesitation and placed a sealed set of documents on the center of the table. "Emergency injunction has been issued," he announced. His voice remained steady. "Professional. Final." "What does that mean?" one of the investors asked. Samuel answered without looking at Daniel. "It means all pending transactions involving trust-controlled assets are frozen pending investigation." The words landed like stones. Daniel stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You can't interfere with legitimate business." Samuel continued speaking over him. "Forgery connected to trust authority has been identified," he said calmly. "Further investigation is underway." Murmurs spread across the table. Marissa leaned forward, her composure cracking slightly. "That's an accusation," she said sharply. "It's evidence," Samuel replied. The door opened again. Victor Lane entered. Gasps rippled across the room. Even Daniel looked momentarily stunned. Victor placed another folder on the table and opened it slowly, revealing transaction logs, signature comparisons, and authorization documents. He pressed a small device. Static filled the air for a second. Then voices emerged. Daniel's voice. Clear. Confident. Unmistakable. Once she's out of the trust, everything transfers cleanly. The room went silent. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. Marissa's face drained of color. The recording continued briefly, just long enough to remove all doubt. Victor turned it off. Samuel spoke again. Based on the provisions established within the Carter family trust, he said. Controlling authority transfers immediately to the injured beneficiary. He turned toward me. Effective now. Every eye in the room shifted in my direction. Shock. Confusion. Fear. Daniel's hands tightened into fists at his sides. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice rising. "This is a misunderstanding." Samuel placed another document in front of him. "Forensic handwriting confirmation," he said calmly. "Forgery verified." Daniel's confidence cracked. Not loudly. Quietly. Visibly. Investors began collecting their papers, murmuring among themselves. Some stepped away from the table entirely, distancing themselves from the situation unfolding before them. Marissa leaned toward Daniel, whispering urgently, her voice sharp and desperate. But nothing she said changed what had already happened. I stepped forward slowly. Every movement felt deliberate. Controlled. Final. Then I moved toward the head of the table, toward Daniel's chair. For a moment, he didn't move. He simply stared at me, disbelief settling into his expression like something breaking. Then he stepped aside. I placed my hands on the back of the chair and lowered myself into it. The same seat he occupied minutes earlier. Authority shifting physically, symbolically, irreversibly. "This company is not for sale," I said. Not loudly. Not angrily. Just clearly. Silence followed. Deep. Complete. One by one, investors began leaving the room, their confidence replaced by caution. Daniel and Marissa remained seated, frozen in place as the structure they built around deception collapsed piece by piece. I gathered the documents slowly, organizing them into neat stacks. Victory didn't feel loud. It felt steady, controlled. Samuel leaned slightly toward me as the room emptied. "This isn't over yet," he said quietly. I turned toward him. "What do you mean?" "There is still one unresolved provision inside the trust," he replied. My chest tightened slightly. Another layer. Another secret. Something even Daniel hadn't anticipated. As the last investor stepped out of the room and the door closed behind them, a strange calm settled over the space. The battle had been won, but something deeper still waited beneath the surface. And in that moment, sitting at the head of the table for the first time in my life, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. This victory wasn't the end. It was the beginning of discovering the final truth my grandfather left behind.